"So this is your retirement party? Mom, just not really for you," Daniel said, glancing past Margaret as if she were standing in someone else's house. Margaret Whitmore stood in the doorway of her own living room, her coat still draped over her arm, her sensible low heels tapping once against the hardwood floor before going still. The house smelled different tonight, too sweet, too sharp, like candles she didn't buy and food she hadn't cooked. Laughter filled the space, unfamiliar voices blending with the clink of glasses, and for a brief moment, she wondered if she had walked into the wrong address after leaving the hospital for the last time that afternoon. 42 years of early mornings, double shifts, and missed holidays had ended at 3 p.m. With a sheet cake in the staff lounge and a polite round of applause. She had driven home expecting quiet, maybe a small dinner, maybe just a moment to sit in the kitchen she had paid for piece by piece. Instead, she found strangers standing where her furniture used to be, her favorite armchair pushed into a corner like an afterthought, and her son standing at the center of it all as if he had always belonged there more than she had. Daniel smiled when he noticed her, but it was the kind of smile he used in business photos, polished, distant, practiced. "You're back earlier than I thought," he added, already turning slightly toward a woman beside him, Olivia, who held a glass of white wine and scanned Margaret with a quick, assessing glance before returning her attention to the guests. Margaret didn't answer right away. She took a step forward, then another, her eyes moving slowly across the room, cataloging the changes. The framed photo of Daniel's high school graduation was gone from the mantel. The blue ceramic bowl she had bought on a road trip years ago was replaced with something modern and cold. Even the curtains had been changed. "What is all this?" she asked finally, her voice calm, almost gentle, the way she used to speak to nervous patients. Daniel let out a small laugh, as if the question were unnecessary. "It's just a gathering," he said. "A few people from work. Some friends." Olivia thought it would be a good opportunity. Opportunity. The word settled in the air between them, heavier than it should have been. Margaret shifted her coat to the other arm. No one had asked her. No one had told her. In her own house, on the day she stopped working for the first time since she was 26, she had not been part of the plan. Someone brushed past her, carrying a tray of drinks, offering a quick "excuse me" without meeting her eyes. Margaret stepped aside automatically, the same way she had done in hospital corridors for decades, making space for others, letting them pass. She noticed then that the hallway light had been replaced with a brighter fixture, one that cast everything in a harsher glow. Even the walls seemed different. "Mom, you can put your things upstairs," Daniel said, gesturing vaguely toward the staircase. "We've set up the guest room for you. It'll be more comfortable." Guest room. The words were simple, almost casual, but they landed with a quiet finality. Margaret looked at him, really looked this time, at the way he avoided holding her gaze, at the way Olivia's hand rested lightly on his arm, guiding him, anchoring him. For a second, something flickered behind Margaret's eyes. Not confusion, not even hurt, but recognition. She nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging a fact that had been waiting for her to see it. Then she moved further into the house, her house, past the voices and the laughter, past the strangers who filled the space she had built, her steps measured, her expression unreadable, as if she were already beginning to understand that whatever this evening was, it was not about celebration, and it was never meant to be. Margaret closed the guest room door behind her with a quiet click, the kind of soft sound that used to mean privacy but now felt like distance. The room smelled faintly of fresh linen and something artificial, like it had been prepared for a visitor who was never meant to stay long. She placed her coat carefully over the back of a chair that did not belong to her and stood still for a moment, her eyes adjusting to the unfamiliar arrangement. The bed was smaller than the one she had slept in for decades, the dresser bare except for a single lamp, and the window looked out over the side yard instead of the garden she had planted herself 20 years ago. She moved toward it slowly, her fingers brushing against the edge of the curtain, noting the fabric was new, stiff, and without the soft wear of time. Downstairs, laughter rose again, louder this time, followed by the faint sound of music she did not recognize. Margaret listened without reacting, her expression unchanged, but her mind began to move in quiet, deliberate steps. This house had not changed all at once. She could see it now. The signs had been there. Subtle at first, easy to dismiss. The new light fixture in the hallway, the missing photo on the mantel, the way Olivia had started referring to spaces as if they were already hers. Margaret walked to the closet and opened it. Inside, her clothes had been shifted to one side, neatly arranged but reduced, as if someone had decided how much space she was allowed to take. The rest of the closet was empty, waiting. She reached out and touched one of her jackets, her fingers lingering on the sleeve, then let her hand fall. For years, she had followed a routine that left little room for reflection. Wake up at 5:30. Coffee at the kitchen table. A 12-hour shift that stretched into 14 more often than not. She had told herself that the long hours were temporary, that one day there would be time to rest, to enjoy the home she had worked so hard to keep. She remembered signing the final mortgage payment, sitting at this very table, Daniel beside her, younger then, grateful, promising that she would never have to worry again. The memory did not sting the way it should have. It simply settled beside everything else, another piece fitting into place. Margaret turned away from the closet and sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress dipped slightly under her weight, unfamiliar, untested. She placed her hands in her lap and listened again. Someone downstairs mentioned renovations. Another voice laughed about space, about potential, about making things more modern. Olivia's voice followed, smooth and confident, explaining something about hosting more events, about opening up the layout, about making the house work better for their future. Their future. Margaret did not close her eyes. She did not sigh. She simply sat there, absorbing each word as if it were being written down somewhere inside her, permanent and clear. No one had asked her what she wanted. No one had paused to consider that she was still there, still listening, still understanding. After a while, she stood up again, her movements steady, almost methodical. She walked to the small desk in the corner of the room and ran her fingers across its surface, then reached into her handbag and took out her phone. The screen lit up in the dim light, reflecting faintly in her eyes. For a second, she hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but as if marking the moment. Then she unlocked it and began to scroll, her face calm, her posture straight, as the noise from downstairs continued, unaware that something had already begun to shift. Margaret remained seated for a few seconds longer, the faint glow of her phone screen reflecting against her steady gaze, before she locked it again and slipped it back into her handbag without making a call. Downstairs, the music shifted into something louder, more confident, followed by a round of applause that echoed faintly through the floorboards. She stood, smoothing the front of her blouse with a small, deliberate motion, then opened the door and stepped back into the hallway. The brighter light overhead cast sharp shadows along the walls, and for a moment, she noticed how every detail seemed slightly out of place, as if the house itself had been rearranged to tell a different story. As she walked toward the staircase, voices drifted upward. Clearer now. Olivia was speaking again, her tone light but controlled, explaining how the space would be used moving forward, how the dining area could be expanded, how the upstairs rooms could be repurposed to better suit their needs. Someone asked about long-term plans, and Olivia laughed softly before replying that everything was already in motion. Margaret paused halfway down the stairs, her hand resting lightly on the railing, her presence unnoticed. Then Daniel's voice joined in, casual, almost reassuring. He mentioned timelines, mentioned transitions, mentioned making sure everything would be easier for everyone involved. Easier. Margaret listened without shifting her expression. Her eyes focused ahead as if she were simply taking in the scene below. A guest asked where she was, and Daniel hesitated for just a fraction of a second before answering that she was upstairs resting, that it had been a long day for her. The conversation moved on quickly, as if her absence required no further explanation. Margaret descended the rest of the stairs at the same measured pace, her steps quiet against the wood. No one turned immediately. The room remained full of movement, of gestures, of conversations that did not include her. When someone finally noticed her standing near the edge of the room, there was a brief pause, a flicker of acknowledgement, and then the rhythm resumed, unchanged. Olivia offered a polite smile, the kind reserved for acquaintances, and lifted her glass slightly in greeting before turning back to the group. Margaret did not return the gesture. Instead, she moved slowly along the wall, her gaze passing over the people gathered in her living room, noting the way they stood, the way they spoke, the way they occupied the space with a certainty she had not granted them. She stopped near the mantel, or where the mantel used to hold pieces of her life, and noticed a stack of printed documents partially tucked beneath a decorative tray. The corner of one page was visible, marked with a bold heading she could not fully read from where she stood. She did not reach for it. Not yet. Instead, she turned her attention to Daniel, who was explaining something to a man in a tailored jacket, gesturing toward the open layout as if he had designed it himself. There was no hesitation in his voice now. No uncertainty. Margaret watched him for a moment longer, her face calm, her posture straight, as if committing the image to memory. Then, without interrupting, without drawing attention, she stepped slightly closer to the table, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the papers, just enough to feel their presence, just enough to know they were real. The laughter rose again, filling the room, but Margaret did not look up. She only stood there, still and quiet. As the pieces continued to arrange themselves in a pattern, she was beginning to understand with absolute clarity. Margaret did not pick up the papers immediately, but the bold edge of the document stayed in her peripheral vision, like a quiet signal that refused to fade. Instead, she let her hand rest lightly on the table for a moment, her fingertips barely touching the smooth surface before she withdrew them and turned away as if nothing had caught her attention at all. The conversation around her continued, effortless and loud, filled with plans that sounded finished rather than discussed. She moved slowly toward the kitchen, following the familiar path her feet had memorized over decades. But even there, things felt altered in ways that were subtle and deliberate. The set of ceramic dishes she used every morning was no longer on the counter. The small clock above the stove, the one she checked before every early shift, had been replaced with something sleeker, quieter, less personal. She paused near the sink, her eyes scanning the space with the same careful observation she had once used in hospital rooms, noting what was present, what was missing, and what did not belong. From the living room, Olivia's voice carried again, clearer now without the distraction of movement. She was speaking about timing, about making sure everything aligned before the end of the quarter, about not delaying decisions that had already been agreed upon. Margaret did not need to hear every word to understand the direction of the conversation. She had spent years listening between sentences, recognizing meaning before it was fully spoken. A man asked a question about ownership, about whether everything had already been transferred, and there was a brief pause before Olivia answered, her tone steady, confident, as she explained that they were in the process of finalizing details, and that nothing would interfere with their plans. Their plans. Margaret's gaze shifted slightly, focusing on the reflection in the kitchen window, where the movement of the living room appeared faint and distorted. She could see Daniel there, nodding along, his posture relaxed, his attention fixed entirely on the future being described around him. There was no hesitation left in him, no trace of the young man who once asked her for advice before making decisions. Margaret reached for a glass, filled it halfway with water, and held it without drinking, her grip steady, her expression unchanged. The realization did not arrive all at once, settled piece by piece, each detail aligning with the next until there was no space left for doubt. This was not a misunderstanding. It was not a spontaneous gathering or a poorly communicated plan. It had been organized, prepared, and carried out with a level of certainty that excluded her completely. She placed the glass back down exactly where she had found it and turned toward the doorway again, her movements calm, almost deliberate in their precision. As she stepped back into view of the living room, she noticed the documents on the table had shifted slightly, as if someone had glanced at them and then left them behind without concern. This time, she did not hesitate. She reached out, lifted the top page just enough to read the heading, and let her eyes move across the first few lines. Property assessment. Proposed restructuring. Timeline for transition. The words were clear, formal, and unmistakable. Margaret lowered the page back into place without drawing attention, her fingers smoothing the edge before she let go. Around her, the laughter continued, untouched by what she had just seen. She did not look at Daniel. She did not look at Olivia. Instead, she stepped away from the table once more, her posture straight, her face composed, carrying with her the quiet certainty that whatever was unfolding in this house had already crossed a line they did not realize she had been watching all along. Margaret moved through the room without urgency, as if she had already accepted the rhythm of the evening, as if nothing had shifted beneath the surface. She stopped briefly near a group of guests who were discussing market trends and renovation costs, their voices blending into a steady hum of confidence and assumption. No one asked her opinion. No one turned to include her. It was not deliberate in the way a direct insult would be. It was quieter than that, more complete. She stood there long enough to confirm it, then continued walking, her steps measured, her expression unchanged. Near the far side of the room, an older man stood slightly apart from the others, his posture reserved, his attention not entirely fixed on the conversation around him. He noticed Margaret before she reached him, offering a small, polite nod that felt different from the others, less rehearsed. "You must be Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his voice calm, professional. Margaret met his gaze steadily. "I am," she replied. He introduced himself as Harold Bennett, his name familiar in a distant way. as if she had heard it once before but had not needed to remember it. "I believe we have a few mutual connections," he added, glancing briefly toward Daniel and Olivia before returning his attention to her. Margaret did not ask how. She simply waited. There was a pause, brief but intentional, before Harold spoke again, lowering his voice just enough to separate his words from the surrounding noise. "I was under the impression you would be involved in tonight's discussions," he said carefully. Margaret held his gaze, her expression calm, giving nothing away. "Was I?" she asked. Harold hesitated for a fraction of a second, then adjusted his stance slightly, as if recalibrating what he had assumed. "There are documents being reviewed," he continued, choosing his words with precision. "Preliminary steps. Nothing finalized, but significant enough that it would usually involve all parties directly connected to the property." Margaret did not look back toward the table. She did not need to. "And yet," she said quietly, "no one thought to mention it." Harold's expression shifted, not into surprise, but into recognition. He understood more from what was not being said than from what was. "That is what concerns me," he replied. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Around them, laughter rose again. Glasses clinked. Plans continued to unfold as if they were already decided. Margaret studied him briefly, noting the absence of arrogance in his posture, the lack of urgency in his tone. He was not part of the performance. He was observing it. "You are not here as a guest," she said, not as a question. Harold allowed himself a faint, almost reluctant smile. "No," he admitted. "I was invited to look over some structural and financial projections, expansion, restructuring, potential asset adjustments." He paused, then added, "I assumed you were aware." Margaret inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement without agreeing with it. The pieces aligned further. Clearer now. Sharper. She had seen the documents. She had heard the plans. Now she understood the scale. This was not a suggestion. It was an operation already in motion. "Thank you," she said, her voice even, controlled. Harold nodded once, as if that was all he had intended to offer. "You might want to review everything personally," he added quietly, "before anything progresses further." Margaret did not respond immediately. Instead, she let the silence settle between them. Not uncomfortable, not uncertain, just present. Then she gave a small nod, the kind that marked a decision rather than a reaction. "I will," she said. And with that, she turned away, not hurried, not unsettled, but carrying with her a clarity that had not been there an hour ago. While behind her, the room continued exactly as it had before, unaware that its foundation had just been quietly, irrevocably acknowledged. Margaret did not return to the center of the room after that conversation. Instead, she moved quietly toward the staircase again, her steps steady, her posture unchanged, as if she were simply retiring early after a long day. No one stopped her. No one asked where she was going. The music continued behind her, blending with laughter and the low hum of confident voices that no longer felt unfamiliar, only expected. When she reached the guest room, she closed the door gently and stood in the silence that followed, a silence that felt more honest than anything she had heard downstairs. She did not sit immediately. She walked to the window first, looking out into the dim outline of the side yard, where the small garden she once tended had been left untouched. shadows stretching across it in uneven lines. For a moment, she let her gaze rest there, not with longing, but with a quiet recognition of distance. Then she turned back into the room and reached for her handbag, placing it carefully on the desk before opening it. Her movements were unhurried, precise, the same controlled rhythm she had used for decades when handling delicate situations that required clarity over emotion. She took out her phone again, but this time she did not hesitate. She scrolled through her contacts with a steady hand until she found a name she had not needed to call in years. The line rang once, twice, and then connected. "This is Margaret Whitmore," she said, her voice calm, measured. "I would like to schedule a review of my property documents first thing tomorrow morning." There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by a professional acknowledgement, the kind that carried no questions, only confirmation. Margaret listened, then nodded slightly, even though the other person could not see her. "Yes," she added. "I would prefer a full assessment. Ownership, transfers, any pending authorizations." She ended the call without further explanation and set the phone down. The room returned to stillness, but it was no longer empty in the same way. Margaret walked to the closet again, opening it with the same quiet motion as before, but this time her gaze was sharper, more deliberate. She looked at the space that had been cleared, the careful arrangement that suggested preparation rather than coincidence. Someone had already decided how much of her life would remain here. Someone had already planned for her absence. She closed the closet door and stepped back, her expression unchanged, her breathing even. There was no rush in her movements, no visible reaction, but something had shifted beneath the surface, something firm and irreversible. Downstairs, another wave of laughter rose, followed by the sound of a toast being made, glasses lifting in celebration of a future that had been discussed without her presence. Margaret listened for a moment, then turned away from the sound entirely. She reached for the small lamp on the desk and switched it off, allowing the room to fall into a softer, quieter darkness. In that dim light, she stood still for a few seconds, her silhouette steady against the window. Her thoughts aligned with a clarity that did not need to be spoken. They believed she was resting. They believed she had stepped aside. They believed the decisions had already been made. Margaret did not correct them. She did not interrupt the evening or confront what had been revealed. Instead, she moved toward the bed. Not to sleep, but to wait. Her presence calm, contained, and entirely deliberate. As the first real step of her response settled into place without a single word spoken, Margaret did not sleep that night. She lay on the unfamiliar bed with her eyes open, watching the faint outline of the ceiling as the sounds downstairs gradually faded into silence. At some point, the music stopped. Voices softened. Doors closed. The house, her house, settled into a quiet that felt different from any night before. It was no longer the calm of routine. It was the stillness that follows a decision already made by others. When the first light of morning began to filter through the thin curtains, Margaret was already sitting up, her posture straight, her movements steady as if she had simply paused rather than rested. She stood, adjusted her blouse, and walked to the window again, looking out at the side yard where the grass still carried traces of dew. Nothing outside had changed. The same fence, the same narrow path she used to walk on her days off. But inside, everything had shifted. She turned away and reached for her handbag, checking its contents with quiet precision before picking up her phone. The confirmation message from the previous night was still there, clear and direct. Her appointment set for 9 o'clock that morning. Margaret glanced at the time. 6:45. She had more than enough time. Downstairs, she could hear movement again. Lighter this time. Slower. As if the house itself were waking up from a celebration that had never included her. She stepped into the hallway and began walking down the stairs, her pace unhurried, her expression unchanged. The kitchen light was already on. Olivia stood near the counter, scrolling through her phone with a cup of coffee in her hand, her posture relaxed, as if nothing from the night before required acknowledgement. She looked up briefly when Margaret entered, offering a small, polite smile. "Good morning," she said, her tone even, almost pleasant. Margaret nodded once. "Good morning," she replied, her voice calm. There was no tension in her words, no trace of what had been uncovered. Olivia returned her attention to the phone almost immediately. Daniel appeared a moment later, his tie loosened, his expression slightly tired but otherwise unchanged. "Morning, Mom," he said, moving toward the coffee maker without waiting for a response. Margaret watched them both for a second, noting the ease in their movements, the absence of hesitation, the quiet confidence of people who believed everything was already settled. She stepped further into the kitchen, stopping near the table where she had once sat every morning for decades. The chair was still there, but it no longer felt like hers. "I have an appointment this morning," she said, her tone neutral, almost casual. Daniel glanced at her briefly. "Oh?" he responded, pouring coffee into a mug. "With whom?" Margaret met his gaze steadily. "Someone who will help me review my property documents," she said. The words were simple, but they settled into the room with a weight that neither of them had expected. Olivia's scrolling slowed, her eyes lifting slightly, just enough to acknowledge the shift without fully reacting. Daniel paused for a fraction of a second, then forced a small smile. "That sounds unnecessary," he said lightly. "We are already taking care of everything." Margaret did not respond immediately. She let the silence stretch just long enough to be noticed, her expression calm, her posture unchanged. "I prefer to understand what is being taken care of," she said finally. There was no accusation in her voice, no raised tone, just a statement that did not invite dismissal. Daniel looked at her, really looked this time, as if trying to measure something he had not considered before. Olivia set her phone down slowly, her attention now fully present. The air in the room shifted, subtle but undeniable. Margaret did not wait for their response. She turned slightly, reaching for her coat, her movement steady, deliberate. "I will be back later," she added, her voice even, and with that, she stepped toward the door, leaving behind a silence that no longer felt comfortable. As if for the first time, the plan they had built without her had begun to show the smallest, undeniable crack. Margaret did not rush once she stepped outside the house. The morning air was cool, steady, carrying the faint scent of damp grass and distant traffic. She walked to her car with the same measured pace she had used inside, her posture straight, her movements deliberate, as if nothing had changed. But the moment she closed the car door behind her, the silence became different, clearer, untouched by the voices and assumptions that had filled the house. She placed her handbag on the passenger seat, started the engine, and sat for a brief second without moving, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel as she looked straight ahead. Then she pulled out of the driveway without hesitation. The streets were quiet at that hour, the kind of quiet that belonged to early routines and people who still followed them. Margaret drove with steady focus, her mind not racing, not overwhelmed, but aligned in a way that felt almost unfamiliar in its clarity. Each detail from the night before settled into place with quiet precision. The documents, the conversation, the tone in Daniel's voice, the confidence in Olivia's words. None of it had been accidental. By the time she arrived at the office building, the sun had risen higher, casting a clean, even light across the glass entrance. Margaret parked, turned off the engine, and stepped out without lingering. Inside, the reception area was calm, professional, exactly as she expected. She approached the front desk and gave her name, her voice steady, her presence composed. Within minutes, she was escorted into a private office where a man in his early 50s stood to greet her, his manner respectful, direct. He introduced himself as Thomas Green, and as he gestured for her to sit, Margaret noticed the neat arrangement of documents already placed on the desk between them. There was no small talk.
No unnecessary delay.
I reviewed the initial information you provided, he said, his tone measured, and I took the liberty of pulling the full property records tied to your name. Margaret inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the preparation without comment. Thomas opened the file and turned it toward her, pointing to specific sections with quiet precision. The house is legally registered under your sole ownership, he explained. There have been no completed transfers, no authorized changes to title, and no signed agreements that would alter that status. Margaret listened without interruption, her gaze steady on the page. However, he continued, pausing briefly, there have been preliminary inquiries submitted under your son's name regarding restructuring and potential asset reclassification. Margaret did not react outwardly. Without your signature, none of those actions can proceed, Thomas added. The statement settled into the room with a quiet finality. Margaret lifted her eyes from the document and met his gaze. And if someone were to proceed as if those approvals had already been granted? She asked. Thomas leaned back slightly, his expression calm but firm. Then they would be operating under an assumption that has no legal standing, he replied. And that can be addressed. Margaret nodded once, slow and deliberate. The clarity she had carried with her now had form, structure, confirmation. She looked back down at the documents, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the paper. Not gripping, not tense, simply present. For years, she had managed everything quietly, without needing to assert ownership beyond what was understood. But now, understanding was no longer shared. Thomas closed the folder gently. Would you like to take any immediate action? He asked. Margaret did not answer right away. She allowed a brief silence to pass, not out of hesitation, but as if measuring the weight of the moment. Then she straightened slightly in her chair, her expression composed, her voice even. Not yet, she said. But I would like everything prepared. Thomas nodded, as if he had expected that response. Margaret rose a moment later, gathering her things with the same quiet precision she had maintained throughout. When she stepped back outside into the daylight, the world felt unchanged, but her place within it had shifted in a way that was no longer uncertain. She walked to her car, opened the door, and paused for just a second before getting in. Her reflection faintly visible in the window, steady, controlled, and fully aware of what would come next. Margaret did not drive back immediately. She sat in the car for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, her gaze steady as the quiet certainty of the morning settled fully into place. There was no urgency in her movements now, no need to rush toward confrontation or explanation. Everything that needed to be understood had already been clarified. When she finally started the engine, she pulled out of the parking lot with the same controlled precision, her route familiar, her pace unchanged. By the time she turned onto her street, the house stood exactly as she had left it, unchanged from the outside. its calm exterior offering no indication of what had shifted beneath it. She stepped out and walked toward the front door, her posture straight, her expression composed. Inside, the house was quieter than the night before, but not empty. Voices carried faintly from the living room, lower now, more focused, as if discussions had continued beyond the celebration. Margaret entered without hesitation. This time, when she stepped into the room, the conversation did not continue uninterrupted. Daniel looked up first, his expression tightening slightly as he noticed her presence. Olivia followed a second later, her posture adjusting, her attention sharpening in a way that suggested she had already anticipated this moment. The air in the room shifted, subtle but immediate. Margaret did not acknowledge the tension directly. She walked forward at a steady pace, stopping near the same table where the documents had been placed the night before. They were still there, but now arranged more neatly, as if prepared for presentation. She glanced at them briefly, then lifted her gaze to meet Daniel's. "I reviewed everything this morning," she said, her voice calm, even without emphasis. Daniel exchanged a quick look with Olivia before responding. "We were going to talk to you about it," he said, his tone measured, attempting reassurance. Margaret inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement without reacting to it. "You have been talking about it," she replied. There was no accusation in her voice, only clarity. Olivia stepped forward, her expression composed, her tone smooth. "We have been trying to make things easier for everyone," she said. "This house is larger than what you need now, and we thought it would be best to." Margaret raised her hand slightly, not abruptly, but enough to pause the sentence. The gesture was small, controlled, but it carried weight. Olivia stopped speaking. The room fell quiet. Margaret's gaze remained steady. "This house," she said, her voice level, "is not a discussion that can be decided without me." The words were simple, but they settled into the space with a finality that shifted the balance immediately. Daniel straightened slightly, his expression tightening. "We are not trying to exclude you," he said. "We are trying to plan ahead." Margaret held his gaze, unblinking, her posture unchanged. "You are planning as if the decision has already been made," she replied. Silence followed, heavier now, more defined. Olivia's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the confidence from the night before no longer as effortless. Margaret reached toward the documents, lifting the top page just enough to let it fall back into place. The sound soft but deliberate. "There will be no changes," she said, her tone even, controlled. "Without my approval." She did not raise her voice. She did not elaborate. The statement stood on its own, clear and complete. Daniel opened his mouth slightly, as if to respond, but paused. His words caught somewhere between assumption and realization. Margaret stepped back slightly, creating space without retreating. "I have arranged for a full review," she continued, her voice steady. "Everything will be handled properly." She let the silence follow again, allowing the weight of what she had said to settle without interruption. Then, without waiting for agreement or argument, she turned away from the table and moved toward the staircase, her steps calm, her posture straight. Behind her, the room remained still, the certainty that had filled it the night before no longer intact. Margaret did not look back. She did not need to. The shift had already occurred, quiet but undeniable, and for the first time since she had walked through that door, the house felt aligned with something that belonged entirely to her.